I'll begin merely by introducing the members of our panel and then drop a match in the powder keg and let it go. On my right, extreme right, is Dr. Abraham Maslow, Professor of Psychology at Brandeis University. On my immediate right is Dr. Rollo, who is in private practice in psychology in New York City, psychoanalyst, and a lecturer at the William Allenson White Foundation. And on my left, Dr. Carl Rogers, professor in the psychology and psychiatry departments at the University of Wisconsin. Without any further introduction, I'm going to begin with a general question that I'm going to toss out to the panel. What do we mean by existential psychology and psychotherapy? What is it that we're talking about? What is it that we're enthused about? What is the meaning of all of this? Each member is going to respond for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we will open it up to reactions between the panel members, the kinds of questions that come up and the responses that come out of the discussion. And if tonight's discussion is anything like the ones that we've had up to this point, I think that plenty will happen in the way of questions and things coming out of this. We're going to ask Dr. Maslow to begin first with his impressions or his reactions to the question, what is existentialism all about? And what is the meaning of it to you? Dr. Maslow.
I think we must stress that anybody who speaks about existential philosophy and psychology today speaks really for himself. I think you'll get three fairly different statements. And I think also I'll leave it to Dr. May to make the more formal statement of the main tenets the positive characteristics of existential psychology today. I think he speaks with more authority than I could on this subject. If speaking for myself and for what it means to me, what I see in it, it runs something like this. For one thing, I'm very much impressed by the fact that existential psychologists, who now I think represent the growing point of psychology, probably this is the most interesting area, the new beginnings, the new gold rush, you might call it, in psychology. I think that there is as much negative as there is positive about it, at least I see it that way, that in part this represents a revolt and a dissatisfaction. There are, I think you can say, among the technical psychologies, among the technical systems of human nature, the pictures of man, only two really large and comprehensive ones. One is behaviorism and neo-behaviorism and positivism, positivistic and a kind of an old-fashioned scientific approach, the 19th century orthodox and classical scientific approach to behavior. And the other one is classical orthodox Freudian psychoanalysis. Now, for many people, both of these have played themselves out. That is, I think we've reached to the end of the alley. We've squeezed all the juice out of these two big systems, these two approaches to people, to human nature, and there's nothing terribly exciting happening anymore in these two fields. And I think also as we go to the end of the alley in these two philosophies, we get more and more dissatisfied. Certainly I do anyhow. The picture of human nature which emerges from strict scientific psychology is simply not satisfying to most people for dealing with the problems of life, for helping people. It doesn't give answers to the problems that people normally ask of a psychologist. It's really a promise for the future and for the far future, a kind of a statement, if we're very patient and go our own slow and cautious way, eventually we'll come to a very firm and well-supported picture. Maybe so, I think not. I think partly it's a blind alley myself, but in any case, that would be a matter for debate. About the Freudian picture, which has been so effective in our century, so potent, and has affected so many people in so many ways, even the ones who've never heard the name Freud have been affected. What we find, many of us there, is that as we go to the ends of the alley, to its limits, to the possibilities for growth, we find that it simply doesn't give a tall enough picture of the human being. It's an excellent psychopathology. It gives us a picture of what's wrong with us. It's a very good theology of evil, you might say, and doesn't really make a systematic and theoretical and philosophical place for all those traits in human nature which we value most. Just those traits which make human beings endearing, charming, likable, and so on. Now, existential psychologists seem to agree, all of them, on rejecting the picture of man that's presented by the behaviorists and the picture of man that's presented by the Freudians, and want to go on from there. Partly, I should say that I think very strongly that a third element in what we're doing is the general breakdown of values in Western culture, the valuelessness of the time, the scholars call it anomie or whatever. You might call it cynicism, or kind of a mistrustful attitude about believing in anything. And I think I would say it this way, that we've had many centuries of experience in looking to external sources, external hopes for our value systems, and I think that practically all of them turn out to be failures. And that now we have no place to turn but inward, into human nature, into the individual, into the person, and into experience, into the experience of existing and of being. And so I should say that for some psychologists at least, existentialism represents a turn inward to the self, to the identity, to the person as unique, as, and I may say to the person as sacred in some senses, to find out what life is all about, to ask about the directions in which to live, the directions in which to go, the answers for the great problems of choice which confront us all the time, that we feel that the best place to turn is into the self. And so one of the great combining forces among all the existential psychologists is this very strong emphasis on identity and genuineness and authenticity and being a real person, and being, the opposite of phony, the opposite of conventionalized, the opposite of robotized, moving rather toward genuineness and toward a real confrontation with the self. Now, that would be, I think that would cover probably the two main positive tenets of existential psychology. One is the great stress on identity and on a real self, and on the fate of the self, and the other would be the turning away from the abstractions, the abstract philosophies and so on, and starting all over again, seeking for knowledge, using as our beginning datum now the experience of the self in actual living, rather than some abstract notion, some abstract blueprint or essence, which most of the philosophies and most of the psychologists, most of the psychologies have rested on. The stress on experience and the stress on identity, and I think that covers, for me anyway, about 90% of what I'm interested in this field.
Dr. May.
Well, this meeting is so existential that the chairman has proposed a question tonight that is different from the question that he wrote me in New York would be discussed this evening, and also different from the question we talked about this afternoon as being discussed this evening.
We learned fast.
I choose to call that an existential approach rather than the way you Californians treat people from New York City. But now we from New York are used to making our way through a maze of different questions, and I therefore will begin with what I'd planned to begin with, and it so happens that what I have to say to you will end up with the question of existential psychology. The topic that was sent me in New York City was what are the current new developments in psychology? I want to propose to you 4 developments that seem to me to be the major ones now going on in modern American psychology. There is first the general trend toward the understanding of man as a robot. That is, the making of man, the understanding of man, and the forming of man over in the image of the machine. Now, you may think that I'm putting this in rather strong language. I do not believe that I am putting it any more strongly than is actually going on in a number of trends in modern psychology and a number of trends in our culture. This is the tendency in psychology and other aspects of our society that takes one form in operant conditioning of the human personality, takes another form in brainwashing, takes a third form in the emphasis upon placebos, in the curing of people, or the so-called curing, and the great emphasis upon tranquilizers, other drug ways of avoiding anxiety and guilt. Now, just before I came out here to California, I studied a paper which is very important along illustrating this trend. This paper was written by psychologists at a hospital here in California. It represents the point of view of Professor Skinner at Harvard, a point of view that is exceedingly widespread and important. I disagree with it radically, but it's exceedingly important in modern American psychology. The title of the paper is The Therapist as a Social Reinforcement Machine. Now, this title is not at all a joke, because the author then goes on with a good deal of intellectual care and penetration to describe how, in the view of operant conditioning, both the patient and the therapist are programmed machines. In psychotherapy, says the paper, patients change in the same way they change when you give them placebos. That is, they change by virtue not of what is done for them, or as in the case of giving a placebo, not with reference to the actual medicine. They change rather because of the faith they have in the authority of the therapist. There's no distinction made between change in therapy and brainwashing. Brainwashing is one example of the operant conditioning of human beings. And the author of this paper did not make any distinction. Matter of fact, he defined psychotherapy as the placebo effect. And brainwashing gives many of the illustrations of how you can change people. Now, the therapist, the psychologist at this conference will be happy to know, the therapist is a programmed machine, and training in psychotherapy is the endeavor, as it's defined by this approach, this school, is the endeavor to program the machine so that the responses that the therapist should then be given, should then give the patient, are programmed into him. Matter of fact, there's already a plan in operation to build a tape recorder that will take the place of the therapist. You may think that's a joke. It is simply a fact presented from this point of view. There was a joke that used to go around New York City that you may already have heard about the analyst who decided he was wasting too much time listening to the association of his patients. So he went to an efficiency expert. The efficiency expert said to him, "Yes, you certainly are wasting too much time. What you should have is a tape recorder. Put the tape recorder in your office, then you can go about more pressing business and listen to the tapes at night or whenever you get around to it." So the analyst tried this, and it worked very successfully. After 2 or 3 weeks, in the middle of the morning, he was down at the corner drugstore having coffee, and who should walk in but the patient for that particular hour? The analyst raised his eyebrows. The patient said, "Now, don't be anxious. I decided I was wasting too much time lying on the couch giving my associations, so I went to an efficiency expert." The efficiency expert said, "Yes, of course you are. What you ought to do is to get a tape recorder, and then you can tape your associations while you're shaving in the morning or sitting at home at night or whatnot." And so said the patient, "Up in your office now, my tape recorder is talking to your tape recorder." Of course, they hadn't heard it. Now, this was a joke a couple of years ago. It's much more of a reality now than a joke. And the next step is that we will make the therapist also a tape recorder. Now, in this paper I was discussing a supervisor of therapists. What I do in New York City, a good part of my time is to supervise in training psychiatrists and psychologists. The relation of the applicant, the candidate, to the supervisor in operant conditioning is, so this paper, and the paper I think is entirely sound in its presentation of this point of view. The relation of the candidate to the supervisor is the same as the relationship of the captive, the prisoner, in brainwashing to the captor. That is what happens. Matter of fact, you see, whenever I read these sentences, I think they're meant to be jokes. They're really not meant to be. What the author went on to say, that there's the same psychology because in brainwashing, the victim, the captor, takes on the attitudes of the captive, takes on the attitudes of the man in power, the brainwasher, because only by conforming under pressure can he still keep his particular survival, can he be free from a more intense anxiety. Now, obviously, this kind of conditioning approach to psychotherapy means that the patient is conditioned to the goals of the therapist. As the therapist controls the patient, but the therapist also takes no real responsibility for this, because the therapist himself is a programmed IBM machine. And one does not need to go into detail to indicate that the whole meaning of human freedom and responsibility in any meaningful sense, is thereby undermined. I think I'm not only undermined, but to the extent that this would be our approach to therapy, freedom would be destroyed. Now, this is what William S. White in The Organization Man means when he says that modern man's enemies may turn out to be a mild-looking group of therapists who are doing what they did in order to help you. And what White means by that is that to the extent the therapists simply represent the ethos, the values of the culture, then they automatically train the patients into conforming, and the originality and individuality of the patient is automatically trained out. Now, this tendency in modern psychology to see man and to make man in the image of the machine, I think needs to be taken very seriously. It's represented in this form of behaviorism. It's represented to some extent, in my judgment, in the dogmatic aspects of Freudianism. It's represented actually in every kind of a dogmatic psychology, and represented in what is a social, cultural phenomenon of our time, namely brainwashing. Now, I don't think in the long run, however, I cannot believe that this will be the trend that will succeed. And this leads me to my second development in modern psychology, and that is that the new understanding of man as the symbol-using animal. Now, this may sound complex to you, but what it really means is that man is now to be understood as the animal, the being, who interprets everything that happens in his life in terms of meanings that mean something to him. Sexuality, therefore, cannot be understood as simply a biological urge or drive. But sex is concerned also with love, with tenderness, relationship, all of these meanings that make sexual love in human beings distinctively human. Now, traditionally, in Western psychology, there has been on one side the psychologists who started with the body, materialists, and conditioned people in terms of the physiological aspect of life. There's been the other wing that starts with the mind, becomes idealistic. There's the idealistic schools, mentalistic schools, and deals then with psychology as simply a mental phenomenon. Now, the symbol is what brings these two together. The symbol is man's way of taking the material world, physical world, for example, of sexuality, and making this into an experience that has meaning, beauty, tenderness, faithfulness for him. It enriches human life. And this is done by putting meaning into what comes from our physical world. Now, by symbol, I do not mean sign. The reason this is confused so often is that what we deal with in science are signs, not symbols. What Freud proposed, these various symbols for everything, mostly having to do with sex, but nevertheless supposed to include everything, were really signs and not symbols. They exist rather in the analyst's mind rather than in the patient's. Whenever I used to take my children to Western movies, some of which were laid over the hills, where they looked just like the hills behind Santa Rosa, I believe a little farther out here in California or the other western states, when the settlers would be besieged on all sides by the Indians, would have no hope left, no ammunition left, everything would seem to be lost. Then suddenly over the hill would appear the American flag. that would go along with the trumpet, a bugle, and then horses and the cavalry. Now, whenever this flag is seen, see, this has a meaning way beyond the fact that it's red, white, and blue. If you see the flag of Afghanistan, that flag is a sign for you, not a symbol. If you see the American flag, this is a symbol, as it has a meaning. One does not need to interpret it. It stands for all kinds of material things, land, a country, but interprets that subjectively so that it has meaning for the person. The same is true of religious symbols. For Christians, the cross. For Jews, the Jewish symbols, symbol of God, all of these things that stand for a meaning beyond what we can simply quantify or measure. Now, this development in psychology has become well established scientifically. And I think the man most important for that in the last 5 years has been Hobart Maurer at the University of Illinois. It has been thought in learning theory that the reason you learned was that your primary drives, for example, hunger, primary drives could be allayed by your learning. Now, that's the way a rat learns, and we've carried over that kind of learning into human beings. Now, Maurer said this is really not what happens. Now, what Maurer said was against the learning theorists was something you and I ought to know, that you don't do much of anything because you're afraid you can't eat. Hunger is practically never a drive for your learning. Hunger is transmuted into money, success, pride, the having of a house, all these kinds of things. Now, hunger then becomes something quite different from the original drive. And the symbols of success, of making money, which originally for the rat or for primitive man were simply, am I going to have enough to eat so I don't starve? These new symbols of pride, success, and so on become the things that motivate human learning. Now, Maurer, who has worked this out in an exceedingly important way, see, the symbol then is between the primary drive and the learning. Man is the animal who learns not because he's driven to, as he's motivated not by these primary drives. These are taken care of by and large. He's motivated by the meaning of these drives. Now, there's something profoundly important in that, because no longer can we talk of man as an animal or a machine. Once he is symbol making and symbol creating, he then becomes the creature who lives by meanings. Now, meanings, as I say, are not signs. They don't have to be explained or interpreted. If they are really symbols, you don't explain them or interpret them, you experience them. And this is why they can make a real experience that unites the objective world outside with the subjective world within. Now, this leads to the third trend in modern psychology, namely the trend, as Dr. Maslow put it, to bring values back into the picture. Values, religion, and philosophy. These had been largely left out in the developments of psychology when I went to college, and I think probably until about the last 10 years. It's accepted now. Even the operant conditioning men accept the fact that you have to have values. The only thing they say is, I will condition into you the values that have already been programmed into me. Now, the fourth trend in modern psychology leads us, as always happens in existentialism, to a wonderful transcendent unity back to the question the chairman asked, namely the existential development. I think this is the movement that unites the men in psychology who put the human being above the machine and who want to understand the human being as human rather than the human being as a model of the machine or the human being as a not quite so clever animal. That is, the existential approach takes man as human. It says also that science was made for man and not made for science. It says that our science must be relevant to understanding human beings. If our present science cannot understand human beings, as I believe conditioning cannot, then we need to develop a science that can. And one aspect that interests me greatly in this science that will be adequate to the understanding of the human being as human is that no longer can we explain the human being by steps in nature below the human being. It is not only, as we cannot rest entirely on an evolutionary explanation. You and I do not love in such a way because the monkey loved in such a way. We must understand not only the higher by the lower, in this usual evolutionary sense, we also can understand the lower only by the higher. And as human sexuality can only be understood, certainly it's a biological function, but sexuality, my sexuality and yours cannot be understood by biology coming into life. This is part of it. My sexuality and yours must also be understood as meanings and values, putting into form the particular biological drives that we have. That is, the lower can be understood, must also be understood in terms of the higher development. Thirdly, existential psychology values freedom. It makes freedom the most precious value of all because it's a value that underlies all other values. That is, neither love, nor sexuality, nor work, nor religion, nor anything else would have value except as a human being can affirm it himself. This means unless there's some element of freedom someplace, then the other values we have simply are not values at all. Now, fourthly, the existential approach takes the things seriously, again as Dr. Maslow was saying, which are most significant for us, for man. As it takes seriously anxiety, it talks about love. In behaviorism, you cannot talk about love. Talk about sex, talk about the conditioning of sexual behavior. If you're a zoologist like Kinsey, you could make a study of how many times something or other occurs per week, but you aren't talking about human love. Now, the existential psychologists frankly talk about love. Also, they talk about tragedy, despair, hope, and these characteristics of the most significant characteristics of life. Now, they also say that the goal of human life is not to become a more and more perfect machine, but the goal is to become what one really is, and what one really is a human being. One becomes only, as Kierkegaard put it, only as we choose ourselves. And as only as we, in the center of ourselves, in solitude and in love relationships, affirm the fact that I choose to be this being, that I can be biologically, psychologically, and spiritually. Only as I affirm it will I really achieve the goal of my life. Now, they also say that this can be affirmed only in terms of relationships with other human beings, as the I-thou relationship, and also can only be affirmed in terms of relationship with what they call the Umwelt, that is, with nature. Now, I believe that the existential trend is going to be confused for some time to come. It's going to be something of a heterogeneous endeavor of many different psychologists to work out their understanding of what it means to be human. But in my judgment, the existential movement does have the intellectual power, the experiential power, the historical power, because it comes directly out of the center of modern Western man's history, modern Western man's literature, philosophy, and it is parallel to the new science. That is, it's parallel not to 19th century science, but to the new science, physics, say, of Bohr and Heisenberg and so on. Now, for these reasons, it seems to me that it gives promise of being the underlying structure for the psychology that deals with human beings as human.
Thank you.
I won't say anything now.
Dr. Rogers.
Like Rollo May, I too am going to disregard the chairman's question, but for a different reason. As I've been sitting here looking out at this, what looks to me like a sea of faces, I don't recognize you. You don't look like a group of psychologists. You don't look tense enough. I don't really know who you are, and you look to me like quite a heterogeneous group. And I simply can't bear to talk at an audience when I have no notion of whether I'm talking to their concerns. And so I've been sitting here wondering what to do. And I think that perhaps the thing that makes the most sense to me is to try to share with you a little of myself and of what I'm doing. I think some of that has an existential flavor, but you'll have to decide that for yourself. So I'm just going to tell you some of the things I'm currently involved in. If one isn't of interest to you, perhaps another will be. For the last 3 years, I've been quite deeply involved in a study of psychotherapy with schizophrenic individuals in a state hospital. This is a new venture for me. I've never worked much at all with hospitalized individuals before. I think if I were to describe it more accurately, it's a continuing study of the therapeutic relationship, but this time the therapeutic relationship with from somewhat chronic to very chronic schizophrenics in a state hospital. And it's been a discouraging enterprise at times because we've taken, a group of us as therapists have taken a representative group, not a selected group, but a representative group, and we find there's quite a difference of individuals in a state hospital and are trying to work with them therapeutically. It has raised problems that for some of us have been new. I've met resistances before, but when one girl whom I was endeavoring to work with always ran into the bathroom every time I came onto the ward, that represented a new problem for me in dealing with resistance. We've had, I think a number of the individuals that we're working with have gained. I am very sure that the therapists who have been involved in the research have gained. I think we've learned more about how to put ourselves as persons into the relationship, in a sense saying, here I am, I'm interested in you, I'm going to stand by, I'm offering something, I can't make you take it, you don't have to take it, but I am here, I am interested, I do care, and not in every instance, but certainly in a number of instances, that message has gotten through. in a very real sense, this has to do with some of the things that have been said, in that it has been part of our hypothesis that if we can build a real person-to-person relationship with these individuals, then something constructive could happen. And I think that hypothesis is being upheld, but the point that I would realize, the point that I would make much more seriously now than when we undertook the research, is the difficulty of establishing this person-to-person relationship, that you can offer a great deal and find it not received. And so, as I say, we have been stretching ourselves as therapists as we have endeavored to work with people who by and large are unmotivated for help, who do not consciously want any help, whose general attitude is talking won't help, who are of a lower socio-educational status, and who in addition have been hospitalized for a good many years. So, and I might say, you might wonder, and I think a good many people wonder, why we as therapists shouldn't be put behind the same bars for having tackled such a difficult situation on a research basis. It is because we have really wanted to investigate the limits of what a therapeutic relationship can do. What can it offer? I could talk more about that, but I don't think I will right now. I'll turn to a second aspect very closely related, because, as I say, this work with schizophrenic individuals is part of a continuing interest on my part and the part of a number of people working with me in what makes a relationship a growth-promoting thing. How do you grow persons? What kind of a climate makes for development or a curative influence? What kind of a relationship is therapeutic? And we have had the very strong feeling, as we've tried to look into this from many angles, that by and large it does not seem to be the professional training of the therapist that makes it therapeutic, nor his therapeutic orientation, nor the kind of education he received, nor the scholarly knowledge that he has in the field, nor the ease with which he can use the lingo. It seems to depend a great deal more on certain attitudes which the therapist experiences toward this person that he's working with. And gradually we've sorted out several that we have hypothesized as being effective, and little by little we have developed the tools and to measure both those attitudes in the therapist and the question of what kind of effect they may have on the client, whether we're speaking of clients like you and me who go to someone for help, or whether we're speaking of hospitalized individuals. And some of these attitudinal qualities I'll just mention very briefly. We now have fairly reasonably solid research evidence that here are some of the attitudes that seem to be associated with change in the client. One of them is the genuineness of the therapist. To what extent is he a real person in the relationship, and to what extent is he a facade or a professional front? We've often used the word congruence to describe that he's the same person all the way through. What he's experiencing within himself is also what he expresses to this individual he's working with, and he's aware of what's going on within himself. So that's one of the qualities that seems to be important in bringing about change in persons. Another quality that seems to be associated with change in our clients is the ability of the therapist to listen empathically, to experience what it seems like to the other person, to really catch the flavor of life from the inside as you deal with this other person whose world is quite different from your own, but where you can sense and feel and understand his world. And where this is an understanding that is not a judgmental understanding, but an understanding. I guess it's the only way I can think of putting it. Where the therapist is trying to catch the flavor of this person's inner life, not to do something about it, not to say something about it, but simply to provide a sharing person, so that now there are two who can see the problems and perplexities and despairs and bizarre feelings and so on, two who can see it in the same way, so that the client does not need to feel that he is absolutely alone in his world and that no one can ever quite understand what he's going through or how life seems to him. A third quality that we have found to be associated with change is the degree of positive regard or warmth that the therapist feels toward the client. A prizing of the client, a liking for the client, a non-possessive love. I think that's a perfectly good phrase for it. So that it is that quality that we've termed positive regard, to give it a neutral name, that also seems to be associated with change. Still another is the unconditionality of the therapist's regard for the client. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think a great many close relationships are highly conditional. I like you when. I like you if. Parental regard is often highly conditional. I like you if you're a good boy, but I'm not so sure otherwise. Well, it has seemed to us that the quality that most promotes change in persons is an unconditional regard, where I prize you regardless, or I prize you in each facet of your personality and feelings. Well, as I say, this is we have quite a reasonable amount of research evidence to show that qualities like these are associated with the degree of change in the client. And the more there is of such qualities in the relationship, the more change seems to occur in the client. I think this kind of development is significant because while there may be many other, I guess I don't believe that, but I will admit hypothetically, there may be many other bases of change also, yet at least we have put our finger on some of the elements that seem causative in bringing about constructive personality change. And this to me is quite an important thing, and something relatively new in a field as subtle as psychotherapy. And I guess I might just add one sentence on that, it is significant to me, and perhaps will be to some of you who are interested in the scientific and theoretical side of this, that this association between these attitudes and change in the client seems to be true whether we're talking about the therapist's perception of his relationship with his client, or whether we're talking about the perception by judges who listen to recordings of the interview that these qualities are or not present in the relationship, and also the client's perception of these conditions is associated with change, and of those three, it is the client's perception of the relationship that is most closely associated with the degree of change occurring in the client. The way I interpret that is that if the client can really perceive you as offering these kinds of attitudes or as experiencing these kinds of attitudes toward him, then he is in a climate which permits him to change and grow, and change and growth does occur. I don't know how long I've talked, Red, probably long enough. There's some other work we're doing on education, but why don't we save that?
We'll give you a breather on education.